Well, hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Theology on the Go. My name is Drew Entz. The reason you're seeing me and not Amanda is because I'm stupid. I'll be much quicker about this. Somehow the file got deleted off my computer. I don't know what happened. It's probably 100% my fault, but I'm so thankful that Adam, who's a member of the Rise community, has been willing to jump back in and say, you know what, you are a lesser theological mind than Amanda, but I will sit with you and continue to discuss these things. So I'm excited Adam's here. I made all that last sentence or two up. Adam would never say anything like that. But self-deprecating humor is a thing. So thanks, Adam, for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be here and talk about this again. I'll have to, it'll be funny. We'll get started talking and then I'll remember what I said before. And it'll be good.
It'll happen.
No one will ever even know, though.
That's right. It'll be like a good 10, 15 minutes after we're done. You're like, oh, I forgot that great point I made, or something like that. It always happens to me.
Yeah.
So for those that are not aware, we're doing this series called the Mandela Effect. And so what it is a Mandela Effect because when Nelson Mandela died in the 21st century, everyone had this collective memory of him dying actually in the 1980s, which wasn't true.
Yeah.
He passed away in 2013, I believe. But everyone started coming out going, wait, what?
He was alive?
Right. And so there's this weird study that they did where they're trying to figure out why these weird collective false memories are a part of our society. And they named it the Mandela Effect because of that exact reason. So there are lots of examples culturally, and Adam, I didn't know if you had one.
Yeah, there's a bunch of good ones. I think the one that comes to mind immediately was Pikachu from Pokemon. If I told you to describe Pikachu's tail, what would you say it looked like?
Well, Pikachu is the little mouse yellow one, and so mostly yellow. But I think like there's a black, it almost looks like a lightning bolt on the end of his tail.
Yeah, and that's the one that everyone remembers.
Oh, wow.
It's actually just a solid yellow tail, and the tail is jagged. So that actually does look like a lightning bolt. So it's got like angles in it, but there's no black in the tail. And yeah, most everyone remembers Pikachu with yellow or black on his tail for some reason. It's weird.
Yeah, it's incredible. And as we're talking about this, there are also things that people oftentimes assume are in the Bible, right? There's these sayings and pithy kind of things that we know are biblical, and people quote them all the time. But the truth of the matter is they're not in the Bible, and they're actually antithetical to the biblical message, and particularly to the teachings of Jesus, which is why we're bringing it up today.
Yeah.
And I think the one we want to talk about in this episode is that everything happens for a reason.
Everything happens for a reason, Drew.
That's right. I should have started with this one when everything got deleted. Everything happens.
Everything. Yeah, you deleting everything it happened for a reason. There was a reason behind it.
Well, when have you heard this phrase, and what kind of situations?
Honestly, more often than not, I hear it around tragedies. Whether that's a death, like a sudden death in the family, or I remember hearing it like when this isn't really a tragedy, but like when a high school girlfriend broke up with me or something, and I'm just like heartbroken and crying, and someone comes along and pats me on the back and is like, there, Adam. Like the Bible says, everything happens for a reason. And I don't know. I guess it's an attempt to bring comfort. I think that's where I more often than not hear it, is either in personal tragedy or when something just goes wrong. It's interesting. You never hear when I don't think I've ever heard someone say this when everything goes right. Like, you just like knock a project out of the park for work, and someone pats you on the back. Yep, everything happens for a reason.
That's right.
It wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, well, and it's really, it kind of is akin to, when one door closes, God will open up a window, or
Yes.
those kinds of things too.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think they're basically saying the same thing, essentially. Well, not quite exactly the same thing, but I think they're getting at the same attempt, like the same reason for saying that is there, the same effort. So
Yeah, I
yeah.
agree. So what's you kind of alluded to this a little bit, that it's usually said in the midst of tragedy, but why do you think people say it, and what's behind or underneath what they're trying to say?
I think, and I did a little bit of reading on this before the podcast because I was interested in, what's the purpose of this statement, um, and I think part of it is there can be some sense of comfort in a kind of predestination viewpoint, um, that especially when things go wrong. So when things don't go the way you wanted it to, believing that it happened for a reason, I think it gives purpose to what otherwise may feel purposeless, or um, you know something that is just so like you can't comprehend it, right? You can't make sense of it, and we like to make sense of things, and so we have nowhere to place this thing that happened in our life, and so it's easy to then say, well, it happened for a reason that only God knows, um, and which I think is okay. I don't think that's a terrible way to think, but I think unfortunately what is also behind it is this demand that we have to protect God's sovereignty in our theology and the way we think. And we'll get to kind of what this says about God, but I think what's underneath of it is we want God to be, we want something to be in charge and to have control over our lives, whether it's us, and when we lose control, then we needed someone else to be in charge of it. Someone else made this happen. Um, the possibility that everything just happens randomly is terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that oftentimes when I've heard people say this is their own anxiety around dealing with someone who's had a tragedy, right? Like, I don't know what to say.
Yes.
And you have you've just experienced this loss. I can't even imagine what it would be like, but it is kind of a pithy way that undercuts
Yeah.
a little bit about that anxiety and tension, but it also kind of doesn't allow it allows us to not sit with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because more often than not, the person saying everything happens for a reason is the one doing the comforting. Um, and I think that you nailed it there. Like, we don't want to sit with this. We don't want to feel these uncomfortable feelings, and so we got to say something.
Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes being a chaplain in a hospital,
Mhm.
I would hear this all the time when people would, not from medical professionals, but from family members, from friends that would come in that just didn't know what to do or how to sit with someone
How,
and be community.
yeah. So this is maybe off script a bit, but when you've done chaplain work and you've run into that with someone, um, how have you handled, like, what do you do with that as a chaplain or as a pastor when you kind of hear this statement in a family or whatever?
So oftentimes, if it's like in the moment,
Yeah.
right? Like if it's your spouse has just passed away and someone says, and it's the person themselves saying it, then I usually will gently push at a later date and time. Like I
Yeah.
might come back the next day and say, hey, or the next hour and say, hey, you said this, and I wanted to see if you would unpack what that meant for me, or what that means to you for me.
Yeah.
And allow them to just open up and name that, because what they are thinking and feeling, they're still processing. They're in shock. They're in doubt.
Yeah.
They're it's not fair. It's not worth having. It's not that it's not worth having a theological conversation. It's not helpful. It's not the loving thing to do, to be like, well, actually, what you just said was heresy. But that's not helpful in that moment. Whatever brings that person comfort, and then gently pushing them out. What I have seen is, especially as a pastor, is usually in faith communities, when someone comes back for the first time after a tragedy, that's when I hear it a lot. When I really just say, I want to let you know that that's not, that this was not God's will for this situation, that this was clearly evil. Times when we had tragedies, when there was murders in our congregation, when someone died of an accident, that God didn't need this to happen.
Yeah.
And kind of push back against that predestination. For those that may not know predestination, I'm going to boil it down. This is if you went to some of our Reformed friends in the Reformed tradition, they would say that's really way too simple. But it's the idea that God has predestined and has a overall arching plan, and everything goes along that plan, no matter what. And as you said, it's the sovereignty of God.
Yeah. It has its roots in a Greek understanding of fate, I think, too.
Yeah.
There's this idea that things are kind of already written, and we're traveling along that path, whether we choose to or not. Which, going on to maybe moving into this idea of what does that belief say about God, and does that cause harm?
Yeah.
Because I do think there's a way of believing this statement that is helpful. I do want to name that. So
absolutely.
I think we can fall prey to a very nihilistic view too, which is kind of the opposite of this, which is that nothing happens for any reason whatsoever. That it is just kind of particles colliding, and it's just purely materialistic, and there's no loving guiding force in this at all. Right. And I think that can leave people in a place of despair. So, coming up against a tragedy, coming up against something that's heartbreaking, and on your own, as you grieve and as you make sense of how to live with this grief and how to live with this loss, making it have purpose, giving it meaning, I think is just human. And it's a part of the grieving process. We have to make sense of what happened so that we can move forward, so that we can, in some ways, when something happens and you dedicate your work to, your grandmother who passed away, that's, I think, a positive version of this. It's, grandma's death inspired me to work harder, or to love better, or and then after the fact you can go, there's some purpose, right? But in the moment, in that acute moment of grief, this is so damaging, I think, to be told, because it says that God causes harm. It says that God causes tragedy, that God is a puppet master who delights in our pain and suffering because it's part of the master plan.
Well, and that you matter more than that other person, or that we don't really matter at all.
Yeah,
any of us, and we'll get into a little bit about what the Bible actually says about that. But being a part of Rise, and you already know that that's not how God views us is, as a cold and calculating person who's just a being that's just away from all the action, that we serve a personal, loving God who cares deeply for all of us. And I think it's just important to name that when we say, everything happens for a reason, especially someone who's mourning or in shock, that it really is, unintentionally what you're saying is God needed to have this happen to this person so that you could have something else, or that this other thing could happen. And that's not helpful long term. That's not kind, especially if that person isn't in that space. I mean, how often have and maybe I'm speaking for you, but I've heard people walk away from church over this statement because I don't want to serve a God who made that happen to this child. Or, how do you look at someone who, my wife is a childhood cancer survivor, but there were certainly a lot of children that don't survive, to a parent who is dealing with that kind of tragedy.
Yeah.
And say, well, everything happens for a reason. People walk away from the church because that's not who God is.
Yeah. Well, because because if you take that logic out to its natural conclusion, then you're saying that God caused that tragedy, that God caused that deeply harmful thing. And it doesn't, you're right. It really shouldn't make you feel better if someone told you that, this happened to you for a reason. I think that reason is often what they're saying is this is going to make your life better somehow, right? Like that your life will be enhanced by this loss or tragedy, and that's that's icky. It's gross, and it's
it takes away permission for you to be sad.
For sure.
On that loss, right? Because how can I really be upset if this was God's ultimate plan?
Yeah.
And not have faith? I mean, again, these are all the unintended, and let me say they're very unintended. I don't think.
Absolutely.
I don't think anyone would say, you know what? Yeah, I think that child had to die, or I think this person had to suffer greatly.
Yeah.
But if we're not careful, this is the unintended harm that happens.
Yeah.
So I talked a little bit about, as a chaplain, as a pastor, how I respond when someone says this. I don't know if you've ever had any experience.
I have. I not necessarily in a formal role, although I have heard it. I mean, I did some visitation when I was working as an associate pastor at Rise, and I did sit in some of that in the hospital. With a family. I remember hearing that when they had lost a loved one. But more typically, I've heard it in whether it's my own family or my wife's family, extended family. And frankly, the way I don't respond. I don't necessarily agree, and I don't echo it, or give a thumbs up to it or something, but I'll just kind of nod because, and you name this, it wouldn't be helpful to call it out. And in some ways, I think people, when they're grieving, when they're trying to make sense of a loss, that's part of the process. And I think sometimes saying that statement and trying to test it in some ways, you name it, you say it out loud. Does this give comfort? I more often than not, what I'll just do is offer something else. Be this sucks. This hurts. I'm gonna miss so and so. Or tell me a story about so and so. I think the way to respond to this is maybe the best way to respond is just to offer an alternative way of grieving, an alternative way of processing. And so have some questions, open up the conversation, or tell a story yourself. I remember when so and so did this really funny thing, and man, I'm gonna miss that. You know? So
Well, I wonder again, what's your level of relational capital as well, right? Like, if I know this person, I'm going to be their pastor for the next months, right after this tragedy happens, then there'll be time for a deeper conversation.
yeah,
But in the midst of a tragedy, it's
yeah,
hubris and arrogant
absolutely.
to try to step into that space and say, "Well, you know what? You're wrong. I'm right."
You're yeah, well, because in some ways that's another form of, that it's actually a similar response to the person who's uncomfortable with the tragedy, and they just kind of say everything happens for a reason because they're just uncomfortable with it. The person who then calls that person out is equally uncomfortable with the process, because it's all part of the process.
Yeah.
So
It's just a Facebook wall of comments that blows up really, really badly in like real time in real life. So don't be a Facebook wall of comments.
don't do that.
Real quick, as we're wrapping up here, what does the Bible or Jesus actually say?
Hmm.
And how can we reframe this
Yeah.
conversation? I think we've already named some of those things, but maybe just in a closing thought.
The first thing that comes to mind is thinking about Jesus's response to Lazarus's death, um, and his response to seeing Mary and Martha, just grieving and just broken apart by the loss of their brother. And I think Jesus knew what he was about to do. He knew he was going to he was going to call Lazarus back. In some ways, maybe he knew the plan in this situation. And instead of Jesus kind of berating them and saying, this is all happening for a reason, Jesus entered into their grief with them. He grieved, he wept. He experienced that loss. And I think that says something to me. Consistently, we see the God of the Bible described as grieving on multiple occasions. And so for God to grieve, God has to be able to experience loss and disappointment even, right? And so that I remember when we recorded this the first time, this was one thing that I remember coming up. We are so quick to maintain God's power in our theology at the expense of God's empathy, right? And so God can't be God if God isn't all powerful, but we certainly seem to think God can be God if God isn't also loving and compassionate. And that I think when I read scriptures, when I see God, certainly I see a God of power, but more importantly, I see a God who desperately loves God's creation, and is seeking what's best for creation, but is not fully in control. And I think that makes people uncomfortable. So I don't know. What? How about you? What have you seen, or you think about does Jesus or the Bible have to say about this?
Well, and I brought up Lazarus last week with God can't give you more than you can handle, right? That we talked on Elise. But I think another thing that is interesting to me is the idea, and this is where I think this statement is kind of a half truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
That I think of Joseph, right? In coming back with his brothers, he says something to the effect of, which you desired for harm and evil, God used and transformed into something good. And I think
Yeah.
that the message that God can be weeping and lamenting, but at the same time take a tragedy and transform it, not that God did it or
Yes.
will do it, but can transform it into something positive. I think that that's important. And that doesn't always look the same way, and it doesn't always feel right. And that doesn't mean that you don't get to mourn or lament, not only in the midst of when it's happening, but years down the road. But there might be some opportunity for some transformation to happen. And I think that that's the message of Jesus.
Yes.
Is which you desired, and even the cross, what Rome desired and the religious leaders desired for death and punishment and fear has been used to be the ultimate symbol of love and reconnection with God, and that all of that is possible.
Well
And we
said.
won't get into atonement theories and things like that, but I think that's an important piece of it as well. So it is a half truth, which are always sometimes the most dangerous, and certainly a very strong Mandela effect of the Bible, because it just ain't in there.
Yep, it's just not there.
Well, Adam, thanks again for re-recording this with me.
Thanks, Drew.
And we'll see everyone next week.
All right. See ya.